Sebastian Cole had hired the finest neurologist in the province, arranged around-the-clock private nursing, and signed every invoice without a second glance. It had never once occurred to him to ask whether any of it was enough. He had believed it was. That belief lasted until a Tuesday afternoon in October, when a cancelled surgery sent him home 4 hours early. And he found his housekeeper kneeling on the floor of his father's sitting room, crying. Sebastian had not meant to stop in the doorway. He was moving the way he always moved. Coat still on, briefcase still in hand, already composing the replies he owed 3 people before dinner. But something made him pause at the half-open door. Raymond Cole sat in his wingback chair by the window. He was thinner than Sebastian remembered, though Sebastian had to be honest with himself about the fact that he was not entirely sure when he had last stood close enough to notice. A pale October light rested on his father's hands, which lay open on his knees, trembling lightly the way they always did now. The Parkinson's had taken the steadiness from those hands. It had taken a great deal else besides. Teresa Aguiar knelt beside him on the hardwood floor with a worn paperback open across her palm. She was reading to him, not quickly, not efficiently, not like a task being managed, slowly. Her voice low and unhurried, pausing when Raymond's eyes drifted closed, waiting until she saw his lashes flutter back open and then continuing, and she was crying, silently, the way a person cries when they do not want to be found out. Raymond's trembling hand had found her wrist. He was not gripping it, he was simply resting there. As though her presence was the only thing in the room that did not require him to be strong. Sebastian stood in the doorway for a long moment. He had operated on hearts that had stopped beating. He had delivered news to families that broke them apart. He prided himself on keeping steady in impossible rooms. He could not make himself enter this one. He turned and walked back down the hallway to his study, closed the door, and stood at the window, watching the maples shed their leaves onto the driveway. Raymond had been living in this house for 14 months. Sebastian had bought it because the property was beautiful, the air better than the city, the master bedroom on the ground floor to spare his father the stairs he could no longer manage reliably. He had hired Mrs. Barlow to run the household, arranged a nursing team to rotate shifts, and set up monthly visits from a neurologist he had flown in from Vancouver. He received weekly summaries by email. He had read every one. The summaries told him when Raymond's tremors worsened. They noted changes in sleep, appetite, and medication levels. They recorded falls and near falls and the physiotherapist's written assessments. None of them had mentioned that his father could no longer hold a book open on his own. Sebastian pressed the intercom on his desk. Mrs. Barlow. Yes, Dr. Cole. The housekeeper assigned to the main floor. I'd like to see her in my study at 4. A brief pause. Of course. He spent the next hour trying to review a journal article he had been putting off for weeks. He could not concentrate on a word of it. At 4 o'clock exactly there was a quiet knock. Come in, come in. Teresa Aguiar stepped inside. She was in her early 50s, composed and unhurried. Her dark hair shot through with gray and pulled neatly back. She wore a plain navy uniform and carried herself with the particular dignity of someone who had learned not to take up too much space in other people's rooms. She looked at him steadily. Not defensively, steadily. Sebastian gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He had intended to be measured, direct but fair. He had planned to explain that the care arrangement he had built for his father did not require employees stepping outside their defined role. You were reading to him, he said. Yes. That isn't what you were hired to do. No. You're here to keep the house running. That is the arrangement. Teresa did not look away. She did not apologize. She simply waited. The waiting threw him off entirely. The nurses manage his personal care, Sebastian continued. The physiotherapist handles his mobility. There is a structured program in place. What I saw this afternoon falls outside the boundaries of your position. Teresa breathed in once. May I tell you what I saw? She said quietly. Sebastian said nothing. She took the silence as permission. Your father used to read for 2 hours every afternoon, she said. He told me himself when I first started. He said books were the one place his mind still went wherever it chose. She paused. His hands have gotten worse since September. He can no longer hold a book open without it sliding. He drops it, and when he tries to catch it, the tremors sometimes get worse from the effort. Her voice stayed level, but something careful lived beneath it. He stopped trying about 6 weeks ago. Sebastian's jaw tightened. No one noticed, she said, not as an indictment, just as a thing that was true. The nurses arrive, take his vitals, administer his medication, help him with his exercises and write their notes. They do exactly what they are paid to do. She met his eyes. But none of them have asked him what he misses. The room was very quiet. Sebastian looked at the row of framed diplomas on the wall. He had hung them when he set up the study, force of habit. I asked him, Teresa said. He told me about the books, so I started reading to him in the afternoons, after my work is finished. On your own time. Yes. Sebastian looked at her more carefully. Why? She was quiet for a moment. My husband had Parkinson's, she said. He died 6 years ago. She did not say it to earn something. She said it the way a person states a fact that has reshaped them without their agreement. In the last year he lost a great deal: his driving, his cooking, his handwriting, the ability to read a page without losing the line. She looked toward the window. We didn't understand how much of who he was lived in those things until they were gone one at a time. She paused. Your father still has his mind. He still has his memory and his voice and his opinions about things. But he's losing the mechanisms that let him use them. That is a particular kind of grief no chart records. Sebastian was very still. The medical care here is excellent, Teresa said carefully. His tremors are being managed well, his falls have decreased, his pain is being addressed, the nurses know what they're doing. She looked at her hands. But in 14 months, I have never once heard anyone ask him what he thinks about when he's sitting by that window. Sebastian did not speak. He thinks about you, she said. He looked up. You? Her hands were folded in her lap, the knuckles pale. He talks about you when we read. He says you were always the most stubborn person he ever taught, and I think he means that partly as a father and partly as a teacher who couldn't entirely separate the two. A quiet sadness moved across her face. He says he hopes you're sleeping enough. The last sentence moved through the room and did not leave. His father was losing the use of his hands, and he was lying awake wondering whether his son was getting enough rest. Sebastian stood and walked to the window. The maples had gone amber and dark red, the kind of color that only held for a few weeks before the branches went bare. He had not once looked at them since he bought this property. When did you offer to read to him? He said, his back still to her. He didn't ask, Teresa said. I offered. And today, the crying. A pause. The chapter we were reading, she said quietly, a father and a son. I didn't expect it. Sebastian turned. She was looking at her hands. He lowered himself back into his chair. It felt different than it had an hour ago. He could not have explained how. What does he do in the evenings? He said. After the nursing shift ends. Teresa considered. He watches the news for a while, then he turns the television off and just sits. Sometimes he asks me to leave the light on in the hallway before I go. A pause. Not in the room, just the hallway. Sebastian frowned. Why? So he knows someone is still in the house. The word settled like a hand placed flat on a table. He employed 4 people under this roof. His father left the hallway light on to remind himself he was not alone. Sebastian's voice came out quieter than he intended. How many evenings does he do that? Teresa's eyes met his. Most of them, Dr. Cole. The study felt very large. Sebastian looked at his own hands. These were the hands that could repair a failing valve at 2 in the morning without trembling. They had completed more than 3,000 cardiac procedures. They had not in 14 months poured his father a cup of tea. He closed his eyes for a moment. Take me to him, he said. Teresa was still for a beat. She looked at him the way someone looks when they are deciding whether a thing is real. Then she stood. Yes, Dr. Cole. They walked down the hallway together. At the door to his father's sitting room, Sebastian stopped. He doesn't want your pity, Teresa said quietly beside him. I want you to know that before you go in. Sebastian exhaled slowly. What does he want? Teresa's answer was plain, for it not to feel like a visit. He pushed the door open. Raymond Cole looked up from his chair. He had a small blanket across his knees and the last of the afternoon light behind him. His face was older than Sebastian kept it in his memory. But his eyes were sharp and unchanged. The eyes of a man who had spent 30 years watching teenagers attempt things they thought he wouldn't notice. Sebastian. The surprise in his voice was controlled. Careful, as though he had taught himself not to reach too quickly for something that might disappear. That carefulness broke something in Sebastian's chest. He walked across the room, pulled a chair close and sat down. For a moment neither of them spoke. Your surgery was cancelled, Raymond said finally. Rescheduled, scheduling issue. Raymond nodded. His hands moved on his knees, the tremor a steady, quiet presence. You look tired, his father said. You're ill, Sebastian said. I'm fine. I've been ill for 2 years. That doesn't stop me from seeing you. Raymond studied him with that unhurrying gaze. You've been holding something away from yourself. I can tell from how you're sitting. Sebastian looked at his hands. Dad. You don't have to explain yourself to me, Raymond said. You never did. Not since you were 17 and came home at midnight and expected me to be angry. And I wasn't, and you looked almost disappointed. A faint trace of something old and warm moved across his face. But I need you to listen to something. Like my son, not like a physician. Sebastian looked up. You became a doctor because you couldn't save your grandmother, Raymond said. I know you know that story. But I'm saying it anyway. Because I want to say it while we're sitting here together. His voice slowed into the particular deliberate rhythm of a man who had spent his life teaching people to carry things carefully. You were 11 years old, and you decided that if you had known more, you could have helped her. You turned that grief into a life, he breathed. That part of you is remarkable, I mean that without qualification. Sebastian waited. But you cannot fix this, Raymond said, simply, without bitterness, and I think that is why this house has felt very far away from wherever you've been. The sentence filled the room, and stayed there. Teresa, near the window, looked at the floor. Raymond's trembling hand moved across the arm of the chair. Sebastian took it. It was lighter than he remembered. Lighter and cooler, and the tremor ran through it steadily. But when Sebastian's fingers closed around his father's, Raymond's hand closed back. I'm not angry with you, Raymond said. I need that to be clear. You should be, Sebastian said. His voice had gone rough. Perhaps. Raymond's grip held. But I'm not. I know how you were made. I had a hand in some of it. Sebastian bowed his head. He had sat across from grieving families in rooms exactly like this one, and kept his voice steady because that was what they needed. He had never once broken in front of them. He was not a doctor here, he was a son. He didn't weep noisily. But Raymond felt the slight drop of his shoulders and said nothing and simply held on. Teresa slipped out and closed the door behind her. After a few minutes, Raymond spoke again. There's a book on the table, he said. Halfway through the 3rd chapter. Sebastian looked up. A worn paperback lay beside the lamp with a folded scrap of paper marking the page. You want me to read? Only if you can do it slowly. Raymond's voice had the dry, particular edge Sebastian had known his whole life. You've always rushed through things. Sebastian picked up the book. His hands were steadier than he expected them to be. He read. He stayed that evening. He rescheduled the flight, sent 2 emails, ignored 4 others. He learned things that night that no nursing report had contained. His father could no longer manage buttons reliably. He had been wearing pullover shirts for 4 months, because the frustration of the buttons had become harder to bear than the limitation. No one had mentioned it because Raymond had not complained, and the nurses had adapted quietly. His father liked the CBC radio program at 6 while he ate. He had listened to it since Sebastian was a boy, because Raymond said it taught a child to hear the world around him as something worth paying attention to. His father had been doing his physiotherapy exercises alone for 2 months, because he felt he was wasting the physiotherapist's time. The next morning, Sebastian moved his laptop to the small table in the hallway outside his father's sitting room. His surgical partner sent a message asking if everything was all right. Sebastian replied that he was taking a few days. Teresa arrived at 7:30 with Raymond's breakfast. She stopped when she saw Sebastian already in the chair. I didn't know you were still here, she said. I rebooked my surgery for Thursday. She nodded and began arranging the tray, moving the lamp slightly so the light fell better on the plate, setting the radio remote, where Raymond's hand could find it without searching. You know his habits, Sebastian said. Teresa didn't look up. You learn when you pay attention. It was not said cruelly, but it arrived like a truth that had been waiting a long time to be spoken. What else have I missed? He said. She considered the question carefully. He used to call his friend Gerald every Sunday morning. They taught together for 20 years. He stopped about 3 months ago. She straightened. I think he's embarrassed by how his voice sounds now. The Parkinson's affects it sometimes. He doesn't want Gerald to hear the difference. Sebastian looked at his father's telephone on the side table. Sunday, he said. I'll be here. Teresa looked at him for a moment. Then she said simply, he'll be glad. The crisis came on a Thursday night. Sebastian was in the chair beside Raymond's bed, half asleep over a journal, when the monitor sounded, not loudly. 3 sharp irregular beats that brought him upright before he fully understood where he was. Raymond's eyes were open. His face was pale, paler than usual, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. His hands gripped the blanket in a way that had nothing to do with the ordinary tremor. Sebastian was on his feet in an instant. Dad, I'm here, right here. Raymond turned his head. His eyes found Sebastian. They were frightened, not dramatically, quietly and honestly frightened, the way anyone is frightened at 2 a.m. when their body does something they cannot predict or control. Sebastian reached for the call button with one hand, and took his father's hand with the other. I've got you, he said. Don't talk, just breathe with me. The nurse arrived in under a minute. Another followed. Sebastian stepped back. The training ran deep. Clear the space, let the team work. And then Teresa appeared in the doorway in her coat, as if she had come straight from wherever she lived and driven through the dark. She looked at Sebastian across the room. He was standing at the wall with his hands pressed flat against the plaster. The hands that never shook. "Sebastian," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Go back to him. The nurse are managing his body." Her voice was steady and clear. "He needs you for the rest of it." Sebastian crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Raymond's eyes found him immediately. The fear in them eased not entirely but enough to see. "I'm not going anywhere," Sebastian said. His voice cracked at the end of it and he let it. "You hear me? I'm right here." Raymond's grip tightened around his fingers. The episode stabilized. Over 20 quiet minutes, Raymond's breathing slowed, his color returned, the nurse made her notes and the room emptied out. Sebastian did not move from the edge of the bed. Later, when Raymond had drifted into sleep, Sebastian looked at Teresa in the chair by the window. "The nurse told me he asked for you," Sebastian said, "before I got there." "I know," she said quietly. "You weren't on shift." "No." He looked at his father's face, unguarded in sleep. "How many nights have you come in like this?" Teresa exhaled slowly. "A few." "Teresa." She met his eyes. "When my husband was ill, there was a nurse who used to come in on her own time," she said. "She would sit with him for an hour on the bad nights. She never said it was part of her job, she just came." She looked at her hands. "I told myself that if I ever had the chance to do that for someone, I would." Sebastian looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The next morning, Renata Voss arrived. She came in the way she always did, composed and well-dressed, her wool coat perfectly belted, her presence filling the entrance before she reached the room. She had been in Sebastian's life for nearly 2 years. She drove out from the city, she said, because he had been unreachable and she was concerned. She stepped into the sitting room and took in the scene. Raymond in his chair, Teresa beside him, helping guide the morning teacup because his hands were unsteady today. Something shifted in Renata's expression. "You could have called me," she said to Sebastian. Her gaze moved to Teresa. "Does she need to be in here right now? This seems like a family matter." Teresa went very still. Raymond looked up from his chair. "The tea is very good this morning, Teresa," he said mildly. "Thank you, Raymond." Renata's gaze moved between them. "I only meant." "I know what you meant," Sebastian said. Renata turned to him. "Teresa comes in on her own time when my father has a difficult night," Sebastian said. His voice was quiet. "She reads to him because his hands can no longer hold a book open. She buys the tea he likes out of her own pocket because no one thought to add it to the household order." He held Renata's eyes without raising his voice. "She knows that he stopped calling his oldest friend 3 months ago because he's ashamed of how his voice sounds. She knows he leaves the hallway light on so he doesn't fall asleep believing he's alone in this house." He paused. "I didn't know any of that." She did. Renata's composure held, but something underneath it had shifted. "Sebastian, you're exhausted. You've been under enormous pressure and I think I'm clearer right now than I have been in a very long time," Sebastian said. Renata looked at Raymond. Raymond looked back at her with that particular patience of a man who had nothing left to prove and knew it. She left 20 minutes later. Her heels were quieter going out. Raymond waited until the sound of her car had faded down the drive. Then he said, "She isn't a bad person." "No," Sebastian said. "She just hasn't had occasion to understand yet that the square footage of a house is not the measure of what matters inside it." Teresa turned toward the window. Sebastian looked at his father for a long moment. "I'm going to call Gerald on Sunday." Raymond's face changed, just around the eyes. "He'll talk my ear off for an hour." "Good," Sebastian said, "you can talk back." A slow, tired, entirely real smile crossed Raymond's face, the kind Sebastian had not seen in far too long. That afternoon they finished the 3rd chapter. Sebastian read slowly the way he'd been asked to, and stopped when his father's eyes closed, and waited until they opened, and continued. The following weeks did not make Sebastian into someone he was not. He still returned to the city for surgeries. He still stood in operating rooms and held people's failing hearts in his hands. That did not change and was not meant to. But something shifted in the architecture of how he moved through his days. He stopped treating the weekly nursing summary as a replacement for presence. He called Raymond on Sunday mornings, and when Gerald answered, because Gerald always arrived early and helped himself to the kitchen without apology, Sebastian stayed on the phone and let Gerald talk, because his father's oldest friend turned out to have a great deal worth hearing. He learned to sit without a purpose for sitting. He learned that Raymond sometimes needed silence more than he needed words, and that silence offered willingly was a different thing entirely from silence by absence. He learned that Teresa took her lunch in the small sunroom off the kitchen, and he started bringing his coffee there when he was at the house. And they talked, sometimes about Raymond, sometimes about nothing in particular, and it surprised him how much he needed those conversations. Raymond passed away on a Tuesday in February. There was no announcement in the moment, no final speech. He had been sleeping longer in the last week, and Sebastian had moved into the room down the hall so as not to miss the stretches when his father surfaced. He was beside him when Raymond's breathing slowed and did not start again. Teresa was in the hallway. Sebastian sat with his father for a long time afterward. No one came in with forms, the house held him there. At the service, Gerald told a story about Raymond coaching the school hockey team in 1989, with no knowledge of hockey whatsoever, purely because no one else would step forward, and somehow guiding them to a divisional semi-final entirely by refusing to accept that the situation was impossible. The room laughed the way people laugh at funerals when the laughter is true. Sebastian had not known that story. He thought about all the stories he still did not know. And then he thought about the ones he did. Because he had been there, in the chair, reading slowly. In the spring, Sebastian established a small program through the hospital. Nothing with his name on it. A practical thing that trained volunteers to offer what the medical system could not schedule for. Presence, conversation, the reading of books, the kind of company that made a hallway light unnecessary because someone was simply always there. Teresa helped him design it. She knew what it needed to be. Sebastian did not become a different man. He became more of himself. The part his father had always been able to see, even when Sebastian could not. He still moved quickly through the world. But there was one thing he had learned to do slowly. And the memory of it went with him into every room. Because Raymond Cole had taught him, in the end, the one lesson no amount of training had covered. That showing up for someone who cannot ask you to is not a sacrifice. It is the only real form love has ever taken. If this story stayed with you, if it called to mind someone you wish you had more time with, or someone you still have the chance to be present for, share it with one person tonight who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about the things that matter most when everything else falls quiet, we're glad you're here.